I'll defend him." Every head in the courtroom snapped around at once. All eyes landed on the voice, sharp, unshaken, and utterly unexpected. A young black woman stood at the back of the courtroom, her cleaning apron still tied around her waist. Beads of sweat glistened on her forehead from rushing across the city. She clutched a worn manila folder to her chest like armor. Some laughed, some scoffed. A few pulled out their phones to record what they assumed would be a viral moment of misplaced ambition. "Who is she?" someone whispered, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Probably the cleaning lady," came the snide reply. "What's next? The janitor taking the bench?" Laughter rippled through the gallery like waves on a shallow pond, but Zara Williams didn't flinch. At 25, she had weathered her share of condescension, but never had she felt the sting more sharply than in this moment, standing before the legal elite of Manhattan in a courtroom built to keep women like her on the outside looking. And the judge blinked owlishly, clearly caught off guard by this disruption to his carefully orchestrated proceedings. "Excuse me, Miss Zara Williams, Your Honor." Her voice carried with surprising strength across the marble-clad chamber. "I want to stand as temporary counsel for Mr. Richard Sterling." The name alone was enough to stir fresh murmurs throughout the gallery. Richard Sterling, tech billionaire, charismatic visionary, calculating entrepreneur, now under federal investigation for contract fraud and financial misconduct totaling over $32 million. His legal dream team had just vanished into thin air. His high-priced attorney, after months of pretrial preparation, had failed to show up on the first day of hearings. Rumors swirled that he'd fled the country, leaving Sterling to face the wolves alone. Richard, seated beside the empty defense chair, turned and stared at Zara with a mixture of incredulity and barely contained fury. "You?" he barked, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "You should be at home scrubbing floors, not playing dress-up in a federal courtroom." More laughter erupted, sharper this time. Someone near the aisle muttered just loud enough to be heard. Bold of her to show up with a mop and legal ambitions. But Zara didn't retreat. Instead, she took a deep breath that seemed to draw strength from the very air around her, and stepped forward with purpose. "I've studied every page of this case, every contract, every financial record, every piece of testimony filed. I know this case better than anyone currently in this room." The judge raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Miss Williams, are you a licensed attorney?" "No, sir." The admission rang clear and honest. "I attended Columbia Law School, but was forced to leave after my second year due to financial hardship. Since then, I've worked as household staff to pay off my family's debts, but I never stopped studying. I've followed federal court cases religiously. I've spent the last 3 years poring over economic crime rulings during my breaks and sleepless nights. This case, in particular, I've memorized backward and forward." The courtroom fell into an unusual hush. Even the prosecutor, Victoria Nash, a tall, impeccably dressed blonde woman in an immaculate navy suit, tilted her head slightly, intrigued despite herself by this unexpected turn of events. "Objection," Victoria said, rising with fluid grace. "This is highly irregular and borderline insulting to our justice system." The judge held up a weathered hand. "Noted. But as Mr. Sterling's counsel has failed to appear, and if he agrees to allow Miss Williams to speak on his behalf for this preliminary session, I will permit it under strict supervision." Richard looked like he had swallowed something, particularly bitter. "You want me to let a maid represent me in federal court?" he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the front rows to hear. Zara leaned close, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper that somehow carried more authority than any shout could have. "I may not have a license, Mr. Sterling, but I know exactly how they're setting you up. And right now, I'm the only person in this room who isn't actively trying to bury you 6 feet under." Richard stared at her for a long moment, his breathing heavy with frustration and something that might have been desperation. Then, with a grunt of resigned defeat, he waved his hand dismissively. "Fine. Do your worst." Zara nodded once, and walked toward the defense table with deliberate steps that echoed in the sudden silence. She laid her worn folder on the polished, mahogany surface and opened it with the care of someone handling sacred texts. Inside were handwritten notes in meticulous script, cross-referenced citations from landmark cases, color-coded tabs, and printouts of contracts, the very same documents Victoria Nash was planning to use to dismantle Sterling piece by piece. Victoria leaned back in her chair, a smirk playing at the corners of her perfectly glossed lips. "I hope you brought more than highlighters and grocery lists to this fight." Zara glanced up, her dark eyes steady and unflinching. "I brought logic and receipts." Gasps rippled through the gallery like a sudden wind through autumn leaves. The judge cleared his throat, commanding attention. "Proceed, Miss Williams." Zara stood, holding a single page before her like a shield. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the clarity of someone who had rehearsed these words in the mirror of her cramped basement apartment countless times. On March 12th of last year, Mr. Sterling's company was approached to revise its joint venture agreement with Crawford Holdings. That revision, which Ms. Nash claims Mr. Sterling forged, was signed electronically from an IP address based in Zurich, Switzerland. She held up a highlighted paragraph, her finger tracing the crucial text. However, the original terms were still valid under the SEC filing dated 2 weeks prior, which means if anyone committed forgery, it was the plaintiff, not my client. Victoria's confident smirk vanished like smoke in a strong wind. Zara continued, her voice gaining strength as she found her rhythm. Furthermore, the contract language uses legal terminology that doesn't match Mr. Sterling's previous business dealings. It employs European legal phrasing, specifically Swiss commercial law terminology, not the American contract language Mr. Sterling has used consistently for over a decade. The gallery, which had moments ago sneered and whispered cruel jokes, now leaned forward in their seats. Her words carried something rarer than expertise. They carried the unmistakable ring of conviction born from sleepless nights and burning determination. Her fingers didn't tremble as she turned each page. She had spent the past year secretly reading economic litigation during her 15-minute breaks, studying legal transcripts until her eyes burned and her neck ached. She had taken notes during podcasts from legal analysts while folding laundry in the Sterling Mansion's basement. She had even mailed herself documents to build a paper trail, just in case she ever had the chance to speak truth to power. Today was that chance. The judge tapped his pen against his desk, the sound sharp in the hushed courtroom. "This is compelling evidence. We'll recess until tomorrow morning to examine these documents more thoroughly and determine if further investigation is warranted. Miss Williams, you may return tomorrow, pending review of your credentials and the validity of your claims." Zara bowed her head slightly, a gesture of respect that somehow conveyed dignity rather than subservience. "Thank you, Your Honor." As she stepped back from the podium, her heart thundered against her ribs. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, disbelieving, shaken, some beginning to show the first stirrings of grudging respect. Richard Sterling remained seated, his lips pressed into a tight line, his expression unreadable. But for the first time that day, he didn't look like a man facing the gallows alone. That night, Zara sat at the small Formica table in her basement apartment in Newark. The same table where she had once helped her younger brother Marcus finish his algebra homework, while stirring a pot of soup with her free hand. Now the surface was covered with legal documents, sticky notes in rainbow colors, a half-eaten peanut butter sandwich, and her ancient laptop playing a recorded lecture from Professor Anderson, the constitutional law instructor she had once admired at Columbia. Her cleaning apron still hung on the back of her chair, stained from the morning rush at the Sterling estate. The courtroom still echoed in her ears, the faces confused, amused, disbelieving, and Richard Sterling's face, the one she couldn't quite decipher. She sipped cold coffee from a chipped mug and leaned over the contracts again, her eyes scanning for patterns she might have missed. There was something about the way the revised joint venture clause had been phrased that nagged at her. The legal terminology felt foreign, almost transplanted from another legal system entirely. She jotted a note in the margin. Compare phrasing, Crawford versus Sterling's previous partners. Her phone buzzed, making her jump and spill coffee on her notes. Unknown number. Hello? She answered cautiously. You were something else today, said a low, amused voice that sent chills down her spine. Didn't expect the girl in the apron to turn that courtroom upside down like that. Zara's blood turned to ice water. Who is this? Let's just say someone in that courtroom today has more at stake than you know. You're poking a very dangerous bear, Zara. Be extremely careful where you stick that stick. The line went dead. Her hands shook for a moment before she forced herself to breathe slowly, deliberately. Fear wasn't new territory for her. She'd grown up navigating it, walking home alone from school through alleys she had no choice but to cross, watching her mother work 3 jobs and still receive eviction notices that arrived like clockwork every few months. But this fear was different. It was cold, calculated, and wearing an expensive suit. The next morning, Zara returned to the Sterling estate early. Richard wasn't expecting her visit, and his surprise showed plainly on his face when she appeared in his glass-walled office. Didn't schedule a meeting, he said, glancing up from his computer screen where stock prices painted red numbers across the monitor. You also didn't schedule someone to save your reputation from being dragged through federal mud, she replied. Her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. But here we are. He stared at her for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the mahogany desk. You think yesterday changed anything meaningful? I think it cracked open a door that powerful people wanted to keep locked forever. Now we need to kick it wide open. Richard looked away, his gaze settling on the Manhattan skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. You came prepared yesterday. More prepared than lawyers I've paid millions. I always am prepared. You just never bothered to notice. There was a pause, heavy with unspoken truths. Zara stepped closer to his desk, her reflection ghost-like in its polished surface. Mr. Sterling, someone has been systematically setting you up. That contract revision was too clean, too perfect. The metadata trail too convenient. And you signed it remotely while traveling, which means I was in Napa that week, he interrupted. Wine industry conference. I sign dozens of documents remotely when I travel. It's standard practice for someone in my position. Do you specifically remember opening that exact file? Reading those exact terms? He hesitated, and in that hesitation, Zara saw the crack she needed. Not specifically. My assistant Tommy usually prepares all the documents. I glance over them and sign electronically. The system is designed for efficiency. Zara's eyes narrowed with focus. Where is Tommy now? He left last month. Said he needed a break from the pressure of working for someone under federal investigation. Or, maybe, Zara said quietly, he needed distance from something he helped orchestrate. Richard's hand stilled on the desk. You're implying Tommy forged my signature? That he betrayed me? I'm suggesting someone used your trust and your busy schedule to manipulate these documents. And I believe it started with the person who had the most access to your digital signature protocols. Later that afternoon, Zara took the subway into Midtown, the car swaying and screeching through tunnels that smelled of metal and human ambition. She found the co-working space where Tommy had rented a desk, a converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and the kind of carefully curated industrial chic that cost more per square foot than most people's apartments. She walked the hallways slowly, scanning nameplates on glass doors. Most were empty now, but one still read, Tommy Rodriguez, contract consultant. She knocked. No answer. But when she tried the handle, the door swung open with a soft creak. Inside, The scene told a story of hasty departure. Papers were scattered across the desk like fallen leaves, drawers hung open, their contents partially spilled. A laptop was missing from its charging station, leaving only a tangle of abandoned cords. The air carried the faint scent of burned coffee and barely controlled panic. Something had spooked him badly. Zara backed toward the door, her heart racing, but not before noticing a manila folder abandoned on the floor near the desk. She picked it up with trembling fingers and opened it carefully. Inside were 3 copies of contract drafts identical to the ones in the federal case, but 2 had different metadata footers. One listed Zurich as the origin point, the other showed New Jersey. She clutched the folder tight, her pulse thundering in her ears. This was proof of document manipulation, evidence that someone had been playing games with digital signatures and electronic trails. The next morning in court, Zara sat quietly at the defense table, her notes organized and ready. Richard hadn't said much since their meeting, but he had nodded at her when they entered, a small gesture that felt like hard-won respect. Victoria Nash strutted in, her heels clicking on marble like a countdown timer. "Good morning," she said with honey-sweet venom. "Ready for round 2, counselor?" Zara stood with quiet dignity. More ready than you can possibly imagine. They argued over the contract's authenticity and origin. Zara presented the differing metadata evidence she'd discovered. Victoria objected repeatedly, but the judge permitted the review of these new documents. Then Zara pulled out her ace in the hole, the comparative analysis she'd worked on until 3 in the morning. "Your Honor, the clause that supposedly implicates my client uses legal dialect typical of European firms, specifically Swiss commercial law. My client's previous contracts, going back 15 years, follow American legal standards exclusively. This dramatic shift in phrasing indicates interference from someone with European legal training." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Richard leaned forward slightly, his mouth barely open in surprise. Victoria's jaw tightened visibly. "I request an immediate delay," she said too quickly, her composed mask finally slipping. "We need time to verify the source and authenticity of this new evidence." "We already did," Zara interrupted smoothly, producing a printed chain of custody report. "This analysis comes from Mitchell & Associates Digital Forensics, a firm certified by both the FBI and the State Department. These copies were recovered from the hard drive of Tommy Rodriguez, who, incidentally, hasn't been seen since yesterday morning and appears to have cleared out his office in considerable haste." The judge nodded slowly, his expression grave. "This is no longer a simple fraud case. We may be looking at evidence tampering, conspiracy, and potentially witness intimidation. This court is in recess until Monday morning while we investigate these new developments." As the court emptied, Zara stepped outside into the cold March wind that cut through downtown Manhattan like a blade. She leaned against the stone railing and stared at the city below, millions of lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk, each one representing someone fighting their own battles for dignity and justice. Richard joined her moments later, his expensive coat flapping in the wind. "I don't know what to say to you." "Then don't say anything," she replied, her eyes still focused on the horizon. "Just remember this feeling the next time you're tempted to assume the person cleaning your office doesn't have a brain in their head." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 unlikely allies bound together by truth and circumstance. "Zara," Richard said finally, "I want you to know that whatever happens next, you've already won something more important than this case." She turned to look at him, eyebrow raised in question. "You've reminded me that courage doesn't come with a price tag or a law degree. It comes from refusing to stay silent when you see something wrong." Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering over Manhattan like an omen. The courthouse was packed, reporters, legal observers, curious citizens who had followed the story of the cleaning lady who dared to challenge the system. Zara walked up the steps with measured confidence. no longer the uncertain figure who had stood at the back of the courtroom just days before. Inside, Victoria Nash looked haggard despite her perfect makeup and power suit. The confidence that had defined her opening arguments was nowhere to be seen. Beside her sat two additional lawyers, reinforcements brought in to handle what was clearly becoming a disaster. The judge entered, and the room fell silent with anticipation. "This court has reviewed the additional evidence submitted by the defense," he began, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "We have also received a preliminary report from federal investigators regarding the activities of Mr. Tommy Rodriguez and potential connections to offshore financial entities." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "this court has been contacted by the Swiss Banking Commission, which has confirmed irregular activity in accounts linked to Crawford Holdings during the relevant time period." Victoria Nash's face had gone pale beneath her foundation. Given the substantial evidence of document tampering, the questionable disappearance of key witnesses, and the discovery of financial irregularities that suggest a coordinated effort to defraud Mr. Sterling, this court hereby dismisses all charges against the defendant with prejudice. The courtroom erupted. Reporters frantically scribbled notes. Cameras flashed. But through it all, Zara remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Furthermore," the judge added, raising his voice above the commotion, "I am referring this matter to the U.S. Attorney's Office for criminal investigation into potential conspiracy, fraud, and witness tampering charges against Crawford Holdings and its associates." 6 months later, Zara stood before a different kind of courtroom, a converted community center in the heart of the Bronx, where folding chairs replaced mahogany pews and fluorescent lights hung where crystal chandeliers might have gleamed in Manhattan's legal temples. The People's Legal Aid Project had grown from a dream scribbled in her notebook to a functioning reality. The space buzzed with quiet activity as volunteers helped community members navigate legal documents, understand their rights, and find their voices in a system designed to silence them. "Most of you know my story by now," Zara began, addressing the gathered crowd of workers, immigrants, and families who had found their way to this humble sanctuary. "But what you might not know is that standing up once isn't enough. Justice isn't a single moment. It's a daily choice, a commitment we make to each other and to ourselves." She gestured to the walls around them, decorated with photos and thank you letters from people they'd helped. Workers who'd been wrongfully terminated, tenants who'd fought slumlords, whistleblowers who'd found the courage to speak truth to power. "We've helped over 200 families this year," she continued, her voice warm with pride and purpose. "We've translated legal documents into 6 languages. We've trained community advocates in every borough. And we're just getting started." At the back of the room, Richard Sterling stood quietly, having traded his $1,000 suits for jeans and a simple sweater. His company, rebuilt on principles of transparency and worker advocacy, now funded the project that had grown from the courage Zara had shown in that marble courtroom. After the meeting, Zara stepped outside into the warm evening air. The neighborhood around her thrummed with life, children playing in small parks, families gathering on stoops, the eternal rhythm of a community that had learned to thrive despite every attempt to break its spirit. Her phone buzzed. Another unknown number. Her heart still quickened at these calls, but she answered with steady confidence. Zara Williams. A pause. Then a trembling voice. "Miss Williams? My name is Carmen. I work nights cleaning offices in Midtown. Last week I found some papers. Documents that I think show my company is stealing from their clients. They told me to pretend I never saw anything, but I can't. I don't know what to do." Zara smiled, feeling the familiar fire of purpose ignite in her chest. "Carmen, you did the right thing by calling. You're not alone in this fight. Why don't you come see me tomorrow morning? We'll figure this out together." As she ended the call, Zara looked up at the city skyline, no longer a wall of intimidating towers but a landscape of possibility. Somewhere in those gleaming windows, Other women like Carmen were making copies of documents, taking pictures with trembling hands, gathering the courage to speak. And when they did, Zara would be ready to listen. Because justice, she had learned, wasn't something you won once in a dramatic courtroom moment. Justice was something you built. One voice at a time, one truth at a time, one act of courage at a time. The girl in the apron had found her voice. Now she was teaching others to find theirs. And in the growing chorus of the previously silenced, the future was being written. One word, one case, one victory at a time. The story of Zara Williams reminds us that true power doesn't come from corner offices or law degrees, but from the courage to stand up when everyone expects you to stay silent. Her journey proves that justice belongs not to the privileged few, but to anyone brave enough to demand it and fight for it, no matter where they start or what obstacles they face. In the end, she didn't just save a billionaire's reputation. She saved her own soul, and in doing so, lit a beacon of hope for countless others who had been told their voices didn't matter. They do matter. They always have. Sometimes it just takes one person willing to stand up and prove it.